bonjour tout le monde. Bienvenue au webinaire Puis-je le sauver? Droit de propriété intellectuelle et variété de légumes.
Hi, welcome to the webinar.
Can I Save It? Intellectual Property Rights and Vegetable Varieties. Thank you for joining us. We're going to get started. Nous allons commencer. Today, we are providing simultaneous translation to allow participants to listen in the language of your choice. You can do this by selecting the language interpretation option in the settings bar to mute the original audio and hear the translation as shown on your screen. And if you're joining on the Zoom app on your phone or tablet, you need to click on the three dots to the right in order to find the option for language interpretation. Aujourd'hui, nous offrons la traduction simultanée pour permettre aux participants et participantes d'écouter dans la langue de votre choix. Vous pouvez ainsi sélectionner l'option de l'interprétation dans les réglages pour entendre la traduction de l'audio, tel qu'indiqué sur votre écran. Alors, pour ceux qui se joignent à l'application Zoom sur leur téléphone ou tablette,
Same instructions now being given in French about how to get the translation.
I'm going to assume that you all are finding your way to the translation option now, if you need that. So I'm going to finish up my intros in English, and I believe each of our presenters will present in English as well. Supposons que vous trouvez la traduction maintenant. Je vais finir mes intros en anglais. Je pense que chacun de nos...
So I assume that you've all found the translation function, and this is a good test for it if you're listening in English. And but the most of today's proceedings will take place in English.
We're meeting virtually today, and it remains really important to acknowledge whose land we are on. As a community of people who care deeply about food, who care deeply about seed, we have a responsibility to think about Indigenous land as the places where those seeds are sown and where that food is grown, and to equally contemplate for whom and by whom seed and food are grown. So we live, work, and plant our seeds into the ancestral and unceded territories of Indigenous peoples who call this land home. As individuals and as representatives of organizations who do this work, we want to recognize the longstanding relationship between the land and all Indigenous people, which precedes the establishment of Canada and is affected by the violence of colonialism, capitalism, and ongoing racism. By living here and working here, we participate in this experience and hold responsibility for that. So as part of the process to be accountable to our role in this ongoing violence in our program, we are in the process of reflecting on a few key questions, and we would invite you to reflect on those with us. One of those is, what are our obligations to Indigenous peoples as the first inhabitants of this land and the original seed stewards? And another is, how do we live, farm, and support seed saving as good treaty people? You can find out more about the land that you are in relationship with by visiting a couple of websites. One is www.whose.land, and the other is www.native-land.ca. If you hear all of that thumping in the background, that is my 5-year-old logging his discontent that I am not upstairs with him. Myself, I am calling in from Mi'kma'ki in colonial Dartmouth, Nova Scotia. And these websites have been really helpful to me in sort of exploring that land a little bit more closely. So one of the things that we love about working in the seed community is how open, how honest, how generous people are with their stories, their wisdom, and their knowledge. And we hear that time and time again from participants who come to events like this one. So we want to keep that going. So let's just chat a quick beat about creating what we like to call a safer space. The presenters who are here to share their personal and professional experiences, this requires vulnerability, and we hope that they will feel valued and respected. We hope that everyone will feel comfortable sharing, asking questions, and learning together. In this webinar, we've made sure to leave a good bit of space for questions and discussion, and so I hope that you'll feel comfortable participating actively and joining in. If you're someone who tends to speak a lot, or if you find yourself maybe speaking a lot or asking a lot of questions in this webinar, remember to take a pause and move up into a role of listening if you think that others might want some of that room. And if you're hesitant to chat or to unmute yourself in a space like this, please feel comfortable to move up and do that if you feel moved. We're going to aim to speak from our own experiences, and if you have ideas for future webinars or virtual events about how we can do this safer space a little bit better or more effectively, then please feel free to private message me or get in touch with any member of our team. We really want to do everything in our power to ensure that everyone feels safe and comfortable in these spaces, and we're committed to supporting that as a team. Having a little bit of trouble moving my slides. Oh, and then they all move at once. Okay, so a few ways to engage. First, please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat at any point. You can choose to have your video on or off as a participant. And you can also change your display name if you want to, or your pronouns by clicking on the 3 dots beside your name in the participant list. Unless you're asking a question during our Q&A period, let's remain muted to cut down on the background noise. And if you do want to ask a question, there's a couple of ways you can do it. So you can use the chat, click on the chat button in your Zoom toolbar, and I will read your name along with your question. And then also you can raise your hand and then ask your question over video and or audio. And to do that, there's a little reaction button at the bottom of your screen. So you can find raise your hand, raise it, and then that will indicate to me that you have a question. And then when it's your turn, I'll call on you and you can unmute yourself and also turn on your video if you like, and if that's not already done, to ask your question directly to the presenters. If you're having any technical difficulties, please feel free to send me a private chat, and I will do what I can to help you. Also, sometimes turning your video feed off will help free up a little bit of bandwidth. And you could also try leaving it and rejoining again. So those are a couple of options that you have. Just gonna wait for that slide transition to catch up. Great. So thanks for bearing with me through those technical details. I'm excited once again to welcome you to Can I Save It? A webinar about intellectual property rights and seeds as owned property. Our conversation today is going to be both technical in that we have a presentation to help guide you through some of the rules, some of the regulation frameworks that exist. It's also going to be a cultural conversation because all of that technical knowledge is and needs to be culturally located because it's not universal and it's not necessarily a given. There's not one system and alternative systems, there's just systems. And so we're going to do our best to talk about those in a cultural context today. I'm your host. It's my pleasure to host you today. My name is Steph Hughes, and I'm the Atlantic Canada Program Manager for the Bauta Family Initiative on Canadian seed security. In this region, we work closely with ACORN as a local partner organization. And if you're in this region and you want to find information about our local regional program, you can go to acorn.org/localseed. It looks like we have 33 participants with us today. Welcome, and thank you guys so much for being here. I'm about to sign off and pass things over to Luke, who I'm pleased to introduce. Luke Jefferies is a member of Ready-Naya-Hentos, which is a community collective of seed keepers and gardeners in Tyendinaga Mohawk territory. His colleague, Janice Brandt, who won't be able to join us today, founded the Gundege Seed Sanctuary and Learning Center. And Luke is a new addition to that project team. He's their project coordinator, and he's a hobby gardener and an apprentice beekeeper. Luke, thank you so much for being here.
你好，我嘅空過咯，we SeedChange，但係調上嘅年月，kan tege rono，我嘅nya，hadino hanu stats sidi wagyote, wagyantos gada hiarons ne ojina kundakwane. So my name is Duthie-Kannikkatt. My Mohawk language. My name is Luke Jefferies. That makes it slightly easier for you all. I'm from Tyendinaga. I'm Turtle Clan. As she said, I'm a beekeeper and a hobby gardener. I say hobby. I've been trying to be a serious gardener, but things get in the way. So yeah, should I pass it off to Christy or the other people presenting, or should I just roll right into this? I'm not really sure how that's going to go.
Yeah, thanks. I think what I'll do, we'll have you roll right into it, and then before Christy and Kaitlyn take over for their presentation, I'll give them an intro.
Right, okay. So I was asked to be here to talk about traditional or Haudenosaunee ways of sharing seed and relating to seed and stuff. So I'm going to give you a bit of a rundown on the history, a little bit of my nation, where we come from and how we came to be where we are today through colonization, just to give you some idea of the processes that we're dealing with in our community in terms of saving seed and in terms of rebuilding community. So our relationship to seed as Haudenosaunee people begins at the beginning of the world, of the universe and everything. So it begins with Skywoman. When she came through the hole in the sky world, she scratched and clawed away and brought seeds with her in her hands as she fell down into the water. So that is the beginning of it. Right from the first moment that a person enters this world, they're bringing seed with them. That is the beginning of that relationship. Now, in different versions, there's different seeds that she brings with her in her hands that she brings down. But strawberry and tobacco are the consistent two, so those are important. The other things like corn and beans and squash you hear about sometimes come with her in that moment. Sometimes they come with her at her daughter's death when she's buried and put into the earth. So it's kind of variable, but the point is that we carry this relationship right from the beginning of our cosmology and the beginning of our mythology and so on and so forth. So all of our history is wrapped up in having seeds and tending those seeds. So as our original instructions go, they call it, we are supposed to nourish them just as they nourish us. So it's a consistent reciprocal relationship that goes around and around. And we honor the seeds every year. Following the maple ceremony. So maple is just going on right now. I'm sure some of you are out tapping trees. So following that, we have a ceremony for the seeds where we, well, how would I say this now? Where we encourage them to continue doing the same things that they've been doing, providing life and nourishment for us. So we're exhorting them in a certain way and then paying homage to them in a certain way and then giving our greetings, love, and respect to them essentially so that they continue to do the things that they're supposed to do as per their instructions. And then we are supposed to remind ourselves at the same time to continue that reciprocal relationship through that ceremony. So that's done. And it will happen soon. It hasn't happened yet in many of our communities. It's usually done in a little bit later in April. But once that's done, seeds will be handed out to the communities, to the families within the community in a historical way, and then the community will plant those out. Now, I don't know if some of you have heard before, but we have such a thing as seed songs. So when we're planting in the fields, the women will sing songs to the seeds to, like my colleague Janice, she described it very beautifully. It's as if you're singing a lullaby to a baby and you're carrying the baby and you're about to put the baby down in its little bed and you're singing the lullaby and you're like, into the ground you go. And then the earth wraps up around it in a nice little blanket and then the seed grows. Right? So that's the imagery behind that. Okay, so those are their original instructions. We take care of the seed takes care of us. So I'm sure a lot of you have already heard about the Three Sisters and all that. Those are important cultural staples that our people had, historically speaking. They weren't the only crops. There were other things, the tending of fruit trees, nut trees, as well as, I call them landscape plants, but they're plants that grow wild out there. But if you tend them in a certain way and promote their growth, you can get large amounts of food out of them. Things like berries, or that Indian potato, I forget what the common name for it is. Ground nuts, that's what they're called, ground nuts. Same thing with the Jerusalem artichokes. Those are kind of wild and free type things that if you just promote them in a certain way, they'll grow lots for you. So it was all in interlocking system is what our people developed to feed themselves, not only just planting and agriculture and things like that, but it took the whole landscape of their territory into consideration as to how they were going to tend and use and requicken. Requicken is like, it's the only word I can think of, but you're putting life back into it. Requickening means to put life back into something. So you're always working to put things back and to maintain the system as it continues to work for you. You don't always want to overtax that system or take away without giving back. That's the idea behind that. So with this system and with our agricultural practices, we were able to store food for ourselves for up to 7 years. That was a consistent historical reference that you see a lot, that there was so much food that we were growing that we could, and at the same time as feed ourselves. Just an example during the American Revolution, that an Oneida lady, a single Oneida village, fed the entire American army at Valley Forge one winter so that they could get through and live on and fight on. They were allies at the time. But this didn't hurt the food supplies of the United Nations that helped them to do this. So that just gives you an idea of how much was stored on hand just to get through lean years. So it was successful. That's my point. It was very, very successful. Seed keeping by itself as a practice would be kept in families. Everybody would have their own seeds at the time because everybody was growing, everybody was doing that sort of thing. So you'd have your own personal family seeds, and you would exchange with your neighbors in the same village, and you'd exchange with people in the next village over, and so on. They were all collectively held and treated as family in that sense. So they weren't traded as a trade item, not like a fur would be, or a or like, you know, like work goods like paddles or canoes and these types of things. They were treated as a living being. So they weren't traded and exchanged as a good in the same way. They were exchanged for other seeds or in-kind stuffs, in-kind contributions, I guess, work, etc. So what changed in all of that? I don't want to say it was like perfect and everything back then, but there was a system that was in place and it worked. So what changed? Colonization. That's what changed. The process of colonization worked to break up villages and families. Essentially, that's what broke down the entirety of Indigenous life in Canada and the US and anywhere really that colonization went down. That was the whole process, was to break up families and villages. And a movement toward nuclear family dwellings as opposed to communal family dwellings and communally held villages and things like that. Things became much more decentralized and dispersed as the years go on. Now, there's several reasons for that. One is the disease. You catch less disease when you're living in a single family dwelling. That's why we've all been locked down for 2 years. That's one of the reasons behind that. So I'll say, Kaitlyn, good to see you. Now there's pressure. And even when in the early times Europeans got here, their seeds were still shared with them, and that's when some crops came into our way of doing things. I guess we started growing the things that the Europeans brought over, just as they took what we had and started growing it elsewhere. So essentially, that being said, colonization disrupted our our good mind and our relationship with the natural world, and it disrupted it in such a way that that it's hard for us to recognize what that would be in this day and age, because things have been so dislocated and because there's been so much migration moving around and things lost, that it's hard to conceptualize a healthy relationship with seed other than having to work at it all the time. Should I talk about industrialization and things like that? I'm sure a lot of you know about industrialization and how that just affected agriculture, and maybe Christy will speak to that a little bit more. But essentially, through the Industrial Revolution, that whole process divorced people from the land. It removed them from from the means by which they can support themselves through food, and makes them into a wage worker. So you're giving yourself away for. There's no way that you can continue to support yourself just on money. In that sense, there's nothing besides buying things, and that's tenuous at best. So that's essentially what is occurring in the colonial process, as well as the industrializing process that remove Europeans from their own land in their own time, just as it was done here. And that's through processes like mass commodification of agriculture and labor, and the legal system that was set up to protect all that. And this goes hand in hand with colonization. So yeah, dispossessing people essentially just takes their power away from them. You can't have power, you can't develop a garden or build power or community without access to land. And I think that's an issue that's come up quite a lot in the seed saving realm and the regenerative agriculture realm, as well as access to land. And that's a hard one to actually address, but get to that. So reconnecting. In recent years, Indigenous people, in particular in Nashoni, have begun to reconnect themselves to their traditional foods and their traditional ceremonies and language and song and all these things. Is one, it's safe to now. We aren't the receiver of so much aggression as what used to be in colonial Canada and colonial United States. So it's safer for us to pick these things back up, and it's needed. It was always needed, but people are hungering for it more now because it's looked at more as the right thing to do. It's cool, so to speak. But in this process, we're reclaiming our land, we're reclaiming all these things, these seeds in particular, and reunification with our seed relatives is a part of this development. So, while reclaiming our connections, these brings up questions about how we protect ourselves from ongoing colonization. It's kind of like flowing into now what we're going to talk about today. Protecting ourselves from ongoing colonization, assimilation, and aggression, as well as build ourselves back up at the same time. How do you do that in a good way? And I put it to you then, as this question goes on, and this discussion goes on about the IPs on seeds, intellectual property rights on seeds, like how do you quantify something that is your relative? How do you even arrive at that from a cultural perspective? And the same thing, this goes hand in hand with protecting land and water. How do you ensure that if you're going to become an organic farmer, that all the land around you is going to follow suit and want to protect that land and that water and keep it free of chemical fertilizer and all these things that we talk about as being net negatives on the organic growing, I don't say market, but movement. And then finally, rebuilding community. This is the thing I think that will ultimately result in seed sovereignty and food sovereignty, is the rebuilding of our communities. Not only Indigenous communities, but also non-Indigenous communities, because the way I see it and because the way the economics are set up, that you don't really have a community to rely upon when times are hard. There's no one, there's neighborliness isn't what it used to be. And I think we all kind of have heard this from our grandparents and so on, that we're not where we were. So to me, rebuilding community in an Indigenous context is really what's going to continue on our indigeneity, as well as our protection of these seeds. What else do I got here for you? I guess I could talk a little bit about the seed distribution strategy that we're coming up with at Radina Hayatos. So we're focusing only on our community this year. This is purely practical because we are still trying to increase the supply of seed that we have to a safe level where we can ensure the continued viability at the same time as have enough surplus to give away to people, that we don't jeopardize the collection, but then also allow people to continue to learn if they're interested in wanting to grow, because we recognize that. So it's a very limited distribution this time. But also, in our modern context, it brings up questions about how we protect our own seed, and what does that even look like when we don't really have the power, other than personal choice and restricting who we talk to and who we allow seed to go to, over what those people do with the seed once it's given. Those must be meted out on individual relationship by relationship basis, essentially. And this is the only protection that we have, is that if we can trust you with the seed, then we may give you some seed and ask some things in return, perhaps. So that's up to each individual grower at that point. But to protect us collectively, that's a hard question. I can think of a couple ways that could work in Indigenous context, but it won't work for you, in the sense that we could theoretically legally exist outside of your system. And many Haudenosaunee people believe this and act this way. We follow the Turo Wampum, typically, which, if any of you've seen this thing, it's a wampum belt. It's made out of beads and so on, and a lot of them are white, but down the middle, there are two purple pathways. One side is the European side, one side is our side, and we're not supposed to cross over or anything like that. So it signifies two rivers flowing same direction, but not interfering with each other. So a lot of Haudenosaunee people still carry this in their hearts and still act in this way when they live their lives. But if you were to test that in a real power, real politic way, I'm not sure that it would actually hold water, just in a purely strategic look at it. I think that's about all I have to say about that. I think the rest of the things I have prepared for you are really more for like answering questions.
That's wonderful, Luke. Thanks so much for sharing that with us and for helping to educate all of us on this. I got a lot out of that, and I think it's going to give everyone a lot to think about when we do our collective sort of Q&A after all of the presentations. So we're going to save our questions for all three of our presenters, as well as Janice, if she feels like participating at that point. I did see that you joined there, Janice, and you're welcome to participate in the Q&A. So for now, let's move on. We'll hear from Christy and Kaitlyn, and then we'll open it up. Though we'll do Q&A at the very end, I would really invite you to put your questions in as they occur to you, and we can go back and take inventory and try to get to as many as possible. So for now, I'm happy to introduce my colleagues, Kaitlyn and Christy. Kaitlyn Duthie-Kannikkatt works in the Atlantic region as program coordinator for the Bauta Family Initiative on Canadian seed security. She's currently completing her PhD through the University of Manitoba, in which she is exploring the construction of decolonial food and seed systems in southern Bolivia. Christy Ceallaigh-Bisson is a policy analyst, also for the Bauta Family Initiative, and also currently finishing up a PhD program in Canadian political economy at the University of Ottawa. Their research focuses on agrarian change in Canada and historical patterns of farmland ownership in Eastern Ontario, from colonization to financialization. Christy and Kaitlyn have been hard at work for some months now on a written guide about IPRs as they apply to vegetable varieties. And that guide is going to be ready in the days soon following this webinar. And you guys, as the ones who have registered for this, will definitely be first on the list to receive that guide when it's ready to be distributed. So Kaitlyn, Christy, I think you guys are welcome to share your screen now and go through your slide deck. Awesome, thank you. Great.
Folks are able to see the slide deck all right?
Yeah, we can also see your thumbnails on the side is the only thing, so you might want to put it in. There you go, you got it.
Great. Thank you so much, Steph, for the intro, and thank you so much to Luke. I'm just really brimming with gratitude for what you shared with us, and for your ability to just really clearly name colonization as this thing that has disrupted relationships with the land, and for your work in just challenging some of those colonial seed systems that you called out. I don't think that we could have asked for a clearer or more compelling or courageous introduction into this important conversation. So thank you so much for your presentation. We really felt like it was important to situate this conversation around intellectual property rights within existing work being done by Indigenous communities across Turtle Island, because ultimately Indigenous peoples and farmers are the original plant breeders, and the crop diversity that all of us on the call today, no matter where we're coming from, that we benefit from is really a result of that seed stewardship and of that deep knowledge of the land and food. And all of that was developed without intellectual property rights protections. And we as humans have historically managed plant genetic resources through community governed seed commons and not through these kind of restrictive systems. It's relatively recently in the great scheme of things that we've had to be concerned with intellectual property rights and the restrictions they might impose on our seed work. So maybe just shifting to the agenda here. So one of the most frequent questions that we get asked by farmers is whether or not they can save a particular variety, which is understandable because this world is really difficult to navigate and it seems like the rules are always changing. And so we've put together this guide and this kind of presentation as an introduction to that guide, as a primer on the rights that you have as farmers and as gardeners, and on the restrictions that you should be aware of in order to help you feel more confident about saving seed. So I'm going to introduce you to the guide and cover a little bit of information about plant breeders' rights, as well as patents on plant biotechnology. And then Christy is going to get into kind of the nitty-gritty of seed contracts and then guide us into kind of more hopeful territory, thinking about public domain plant varieties and some of the exciting alternatives that exist to these systems, including Aussie pledges, but also other alternatives that are sort of brewing to counter the hegemony of these restrictive IPR frameworks. Then we're going to move pretty quickly through each of these sections and really just sort of emphasize what you need to know in order to feel safe about saving seed on your farm or in your garden. But rest assured that we're going to have lots of time for questions and discussion afterwards to connect some of these big dots that Luke and Christy and I are throwing out there for you. We also just want to recognize that beyond these legal frameworks, there are other considerations, such as thinking about appropriation, about rematriation protocols, about benefit sharing, about just the relationships and histories that we have with our seeds, that I think prompt us to think about both whether we can save seed and also whether we should. And so we're hoping that this guide will serve as just a tool to help you feel safer in saving seed, but also just as a conversation starter for some of those bigger questions. So we don't want to be limited by the legal frameworks that have been imposed on us, but we also don't want to underestimate them or dismiss them. So with that in mind, we hope that you can walk away from today's webinar with one, just a better understanding of the different IPR mechanisms that exist in Canada, two, how to tell if a plant has a particular form of IPR protection attached to it, three, how to avoid the risk of litigation, and then four, how to take part in nurturing some of these alternatives like seed commons, like the public domain. Christy, I think you had something to add here.
Yeah, thank you, Kaitlyn and Luke. We feel that presentations like this are really necessary to make sure that seed savers feel safe to continue their important work stewarding the biodiversity of humanity's common seed heritage. We also want to make sure that we give credit to Organic Seed Alliance in the United States, who last year they put together a really helpful webinar and table similar to one that we prepared in this presentation and the accompanying guide. This guide and webinar was very much inspired by some of the awesome work that we did.
Yes, thank you for drawing attention to the OSA. Maybe we can also link in the chat. I can do it when I'm done speaking, or maybe someone will beat me to it, link to some of the work that they've done around intellectual property rights in the US context in particular. As I think Steph mentioned, the information that we're reviewing today will be available in this forthcoming guide with some substantially more detail. It's called Can I Save It? A Guide for Seed Savers on Plant Intellectual Property Rights in Canada, and will hopefully be available in the next couple of weeks with the translation made available afterwards. So let's go to the chart there. So in the guide, we've also summarized the information that you'll hear today in this handy chart. We tried to keep the asterisks to a minimum. You'll see if we succeeded. This chart is really designed so that, you know, when you're purchasing seed or you're wondering about what kinds of activities you can do with a particular variety, this can serve as kind of a quick reference guide. And then you can kind of follow it up with further reading. That will also be provided in the guide. And again, this is similarly formatted on the really brilliant chart put together by OSA. And there it is in French. Okay, so the first system that we wanted to talk about and draw your attention to is plant breeders' rights, or PBR. So this is Canada's system for granting intellectual property rights for particular plant varieties. It first came into effect in Canada in 1990 when the Plant Breeders' Rights Act was first passed, and then that act was updated in 2015. Currently, our PBR Act aligns with the 1991 UPOV Convention. UPOV is a private intergovernmental organization that provides a framework or a legal framework for plant variety protection and promotes that framework so that countries that are members of UPOV can incorporate it into their own legislation. I don't want to get into the whole history of UPOV right now. Happy to answer questions about it later if we'd like. But what's important to note out of this act and out of Canada's legislation around plant breeders' rights is that if a variety attached to it, it grants the holder exclusive and so that includes seeds, cuttings, any kind of material that can be used to propagate the variety that has the rights attached to it. In order to obtain PBR protection, can folks still hear me? It just said my internet went out there, but hopefully I'm okay. Great. In order to obtain PBR protection, the breeder or the company that they work for need to demonstrate that their variety is new, distinct, uniform, and stable. Newness and distinctness are generally determined by whether or not the variety has kind of appeared in public information channels. That might include trade journals, that might include defensive publications. There's kind of a host of things that we can get into a little bit more in the discussion if we like. But those are the things to keep in mind about what determines whether or not a variety will be accepted for PBR protection under the Act. If a variety has PBR attached to it, you, as a gardener or farmer, can save and replant it on your own farm or in your home garden. This right is referred to as farmer's privilege. You can also store and condition the harvest as long as you're not storing or conditioning the crop for distribution as seed. So it's fine to distribute as grain for food or animal feed, for instance. However, under the terms of the PBR Act, you cannot save seed with the intention of redistributing it as seed, either through commercial or non-commercial means such as gifting or sharing or trading. This is where, you know, we get into the pretty problematic nature of these kinds of frameworks. So, you can also use protected varieties for research and for breeding, including new variety development, as long as you're not repeatedly using the variety for commercial production of a new variety. So that's sort of a quick rundown of PBR. One of the questions I'll just note that we get asked a lot about this related to this is whether varieties that have the PVP label or the plant variety protection label, which is the US version of this PBR system, whether varieties that have that label attached to them are also protected in Canada. And the answer to that is that PVP does not automatically carry over into Canada. If a variety is protected by PVP in the US, but does not have PBR protection in Canada, you can save it and use it as you would like, including for distribution. But it is important to regularly check whether the variety you're thinking of saving has protection in Canada. And you can do this by checking on the PBR database, which I think we'll get into a little bit shortly.
Kaitlyn, just a
Yes.
quick clarifying question that came into chat. I think we heard this right to Crane, but with PBR, did you say that they can't be shared or gifted, like not distributed even without the commercial component?
Yeah, if the variety has plant breeders' rights protection attached to it, you can't distribute it in any way. So that's commercial and non-commercial.
Wow, okay, thank you.
Sneaky, sneaky indeed. Okay, I think that Christy was going to make a comment on this chart.
Yeah, thank you, Kaitlyn. So we have prepared this table to give you a sense of where the majority of PBR claims are in terms of crop types. We looked over PBR claims from 1990s to the present, and of all the PBR claims, the majority were in broad acre field crops for commodity production, like potatoes, canola, wheat, and soybeans. What is significant to highlight here is that the majority of horticultural crops have only ever had a small number of PBR claims on varieties. And I hope this table makes the point that as a seed saver, you are very much safe to save seeds from your favorite horticultural crop varieties. There are actually very few, and you're in fact, have a lot of space to work.
Mm-hmm. I see a few questions coming out around how do we find this information. We can link to the database that has the full list of PBR protected varieties in Canada. This chart here, which will be available in the guide that is forthcoming, is also just a great, fantastic hyperlink list that Christy put together of vegetable varieties that are protected by active PBRs in Canada. So you'll have access to that once we distribute the guide, but also I see the link to the database where you can check on particular varieties that you're wondering about is now in the chat, so feel free to check that out. And we can get more into this in the discussion as well if folks are interested. Okay, let's shift to patents. So I don't want to spend too much time here because patents are not likely to be super relevant for the majority of growers on this call, but more in an effort to kind of put you at ease, I'll go over a little bit of information about what they are and what they aren't. So patents are the most restrictive form of intellectual property, but because of our restrictions in Canada on patenting higher life forms, they're not as much of a concern for organic and ecological growers. In the US, just as an interesting piece of information, utility patents are becoming increasingly common and concerning for growers. It's a little bit easier to patent, well, it's possible and easier to patent things that would qualify as higher life forms in Canada in the US. But the protection afforded by those utility patents in the US does not carry over into Canada. So utility patented varieties in the US do not have protection in Canada unless the breeder has also filed for plant breeders' rights in Canada, in which case all of the same restrictions and rights would apply to the variety in Canada that we just talked about under the plant breeders' rights section. But just to be clear, varieties that are patented in Canada, which basically include genetically engineered or gene edited corn varieties, some canola, soy, sugar beet, alfalfa, those kinds of things. It is true that if you were working with those varieties, they can't be saved even for on-farm use. Okay, now I'm going to pass it over to Christy, who's going to get into seed contracts and other good stuff a little bit.
Thank you, Kaitlyn. So yeah, the next category of plant intellectual property rights are seed contracts. They are private contracts that are made between a seed seller and a seed user. These are not technically a form of IPR, but they effectively result in restrictions of access to plant varieties, unless the seed user agrees to abide by certain conditions. So the first contract example is a variety use agreement, which is a relatively new kind of contract and serves as a way for seed companies to enforce PBR claims and extract rental fees from farmers who save the seed for their own use on their own farm. When a seed company decides to apply a VUA to a plant variety, the user is required to sign a contract in addition to purchasing the seed. Purchasing the seed satisfies the royalty payment requirements for protection by the PBR, but the VUA contract will then additionally require that the farmer disclose how much seed they saved. And the company then invoices a fee to the farmer based on how much seed they reported saving. And these contracts are also tend to prohibit the farmer from producing seed and distributing it beyond its farm. And you're seeing more of these kinds of protections pop up in the commercial seed guides. So where you're buying your commercial grain seeds, these are where you're going to find it, and they will have a VUA label on them. And the second kind of seed contract example is a technology use agreement, which has been used in relation to the sale of plant varieties containing patented biotechnology. Similar to VUAs, they are contracts that must be signed in order to purchase the seed. It specifically prohibits all seed saving, and it allows for crop companies to inspect the site where they're growing it to ensure that it's being grown in compliance. And oftentimes it will require specific agrochemical products that must be used in combination with the crop variety. And now there are numerous other kinds of contracts that apply to commodity grain and seed production that we don't really have time to cover today, and they're not particularly useful to the audience. However, I just wanted to briefly mention that there is a third kind of seed contract that would be familiar to folks who are working with us on the Kenhte pepper trial or participatory plant breeding program for potatoes, specifically the potato materials sourced from Agriculture Canada. And these are material transfer agreements. And these are contracts that are used for genetic materials that are not yet considered new varieties. And they tend to be specific to each breeding project. But the important restriction in these agreements is the requirement for seed savers to establish a benefit sharing agreement with the crop developer or breeder before they are allowed to distribute it as seed. And benefit sharing agreements basically define who owns the variety, how the revenues from the seed sales are to be distributed between the developer and the producer. We would love some feedback if there are any other kind of contracts that you've come across that you'd like us to dig into in this guide. These are just some examples, and we thought they might be ones that you might come across. The next topic that we will cover in this presentation is the default position of plant varieties in Canada's plant intellectual property regime, which is the public domain. The public domain basically means that varieties themselves belong to nobody. Virtually all of the plant varieties you are working with are in the public domain. New plant variety automatically enters the public domain if no IPRs are claimed by its creator, or if it is explicitly waived. You always have that right as a creator of a new variety to waive your IPRs to it. It also enters the public domain if the IPR is ruled ineligible by the PBR or patent office. So like if they determine that it is not a new variety and you say, no, your application is not good, then it goes into the public domain. Or once the terms of the IPR protections expire. So IPR terms are about 20 years, and at the end of that time, it goes into the public domain. There are no restrictions to the use of plant variety that is in the public domain, including making IPR claims to it. This means that these varieties, if they are not adequately publicized, have the risk of biopiracy, which is when an individual or company makes an IPR claim over it without the consent of its keepers or community of users. Now, in the United States, the risk of biopiracy has been mitigated somewhat, I say somewhat, through the creation of defensive publications, as Kaitlyn mentioned earlier. These are publications that are either published in academic journals or proactively submitted to a PBR or patent office. And they include detailed information about variety characteristics, its pedigree, and the history of its use and distribution. This information helps establish a base of knowledge about the plant variety that can help invalidate an application for PBRs or a patent. However, it is not a guarantee that the variety or the characteristics will be free from biopiracy. It is essential to underscore that the government of Canada does not have any formal mechanisms beyond PBRs to protect varieties from biopiracy or to recognize agreements made by a community governed seed commons. However, there are some existing alternatives, limited as they may be. The final mechanism we will cover here, used in the governance of plant genetic resources, is not a form of plant intellectual properties at all. It's actually an example of a community governed seed commons, which involves a group of seed users collaborating voluntarily over how a variety can be used. So the Open Source Seed Initiative, Aussie, as you can see up there, has created a pledge system where those who create new plant varieties voluntarily declare their intentions that they do not want any use restrictions or IPR claims placed on it. This means that one is allowed to save, grow, replant, share, trade, sell, trial, study, publish, research data, adapt, or make crosses with it. As you can see, so many things you can do with it. You just can't claim IPRs over it or require people to sign contracts restricting their ability to use the seed. This pledge is stated on the seed package, and the variety is then listed in the OZ database. It's important to recognize, though, that this is not a binding agreement that works like a legal contract or license, where one can sue somebody for violating the terms of the pledge. Rather, it works in an indirect manner by first establishing a set of norms that are followed internally by the community of users, and second, by publicizing the use and distribution of the variety and helps a case that a variety is not eligible for PBRs and patents. So once again, it's important to note that there is no formal means for guaranteeing protections against biopiracy and monopolization within the settler colonial seed system. The alternatives to formal protections on offer also have significant problems, namely the lack of concrete protections and the replication of problematic colonial understandings of how plant life is categorized and managed. However, Aussie pledges and defensive publications offer a starting point for conversations about how to organize the alternative seed system we desire, especially under the imperative to create autonomous spaces and parallel streams between Indigenous seed keepers and settler seed savers to push back against colonialism, industrialization, as Luke rightly pointed out, biopiracy, and monopolization. And with those final thoughts, this concludes our presentation on what seed savers need to know about plant intellectual property rights in Canada. And I would like to remind you all that we have a guide almost complete for distribution and welcome any feedback on how we can make it as useful as possible for folks doing the essential work of seed saving. Thank you for your attention, and we look forward to your questions and discussion on this topic.
Wow, okay, Christy and Kaitlyn, thanks so much for that presentation. You covered a lot in a small amount of time, and I think everyone is probably looking forward to the release of the guide so that they can dig in. Lots of action in the chat, so thanks everyone, and please feel free to continue using that as our conversation goes on. We're going to start our Q&A. And there's a couple of sort of technical or clarifying questions that we could just get out of the way before we dig into some of the meatier stuff. So in your slides about patents, a couple of things came in. So clarifying question from Becca about, for example, red lettuces in the USA that do carry patents. Are we free to save seed and use that for breeding here? Are we correct in hearing that those patents do not carry over in any way?
Yes, so patent or varieties that have patent protection in the US do not automatically carry over into Canada. It is possible that those who have filed, or the companies that have filed for patents in the US might have filed for PBR protection in Canada. So you should check on whether the variety is listed in the PBR database. But even then, those varieties would still be subject to all the rights and responsibilities that come with farmer's privilege, and you could still use them as you would use any PBR protected seeds. So patent protections in the US do not carry over into Canada.
Okay.
And another thing to look into too when you're checking the PBR status on a variety that you suspect or would like to know your due diligence on whether it's protected or not, always look to see whether the status of the PBR is active, because a lot of the things on the database are expired and they would no longer apply. So if a salad variety has a patent in the United States and a PBR in Canada, but the PBR expires, you're golden, you can save it.
Okay, excellent. Another comment came in a little bit earlier on around patents, I think from Tapreen, who just sort of mentioned that when there's a protected seed, she goes ahead and she contacts the breeder directly and has a chat about that, you know, using email for traceability. I thought that was a really interesting comment, and I wonder if you guys want to comment on that practice as an option for seed savers and farmers. Or Tapreen, if you would like to unmute and also elaborate on that, you're welcome to. Not to put you on the spot or anything.
I just because as I become more settled into this thing that has taken over my life, which is seed saving, and I see that it's something I'm going to continue doing for a very long time. I realize that there's lots of people involved in it, and I get more involved in who, like, if it's not an heirloom or an indigenous seed, it was bred by someone. So I go and I just contact them. Like I did that for Dakota Tears. I did that for Strawberry Blonde, plants that I'll buy in bulk. So Dakota Tears, for example, I bought from Fedco. So the agreement is already established between the grower and Fedco that he's allowed to sell it in bulk. But I didn't know if that agreement extended to me buying it to be able to resell it in smaller packages, because I already have a variety of onion that I'm growing, so I can't be growing two at the same time. And the one I'm growing is heirloom, so there's nobody to ask but, you know, the plant. So I just directly contact them, and then I ask them, would you like me to give a percentage? And generally speaking, because I'm so small and like I'm not really a threat, and I'd like to share story, which is something that Janice Brandt has helped me with and Stephen has helped me with, which is share the stories of where the seeds come from. People tend to be very open to being like creating the conversations and the creating the sort of links that seeds are supposed to create, that sort of community I think that Luke was talking about earlier. So that's what I do, and sometimes it turns out great, and sometimes people are like, no, stop selling, stop. I mean, that hasn't happened yet, but I'm sure I'm gonna hit a wall at one point. Well, that's not true. It has happened, actually. I made the decision to stop selling something, maybe not stop growing it, but to stop selling it. So it's a good way to do also your own personal sort of like reconciliation work, I would say, with seeds.
Awesome. Thanks, Tapreen, for sharing that. It's an interesting strategy and an interesting experience that you've had so far in the work that you're doing. Okay. So I think branching a little bit from there, we have some questions about and some comments from you, Luke, in the chat about so the question in advance is seed saving, you know, learning more about seed saving as an act of resistance, and then some themes in the chat about, you know, how seeds can be protected or used by their communities in a protected way without engaging in the colonial system that Christy and Kaitlyn have described, you know, which does, as you say, protect capital interests and is, as we've discussed, definitely not an ideal system to be working within. I don't know, Luke, if you wanted to offer further comment on the sort of seed sharing side of things from your perspective with the seed sanctuary. If this is a good time to do that, or if you'd like to take a beat on it.
As seed saving as resistance? Yeah, seed saving as resistance to the capitalist economy that does exist at this moment. In terms of our own community, that's about, at the same time as resisting those forces, is also the picking up again of who we are as people. And my comment in the chat to Terry Lynn, that was more. I agree that we have our own systems. Those exist and they work to a degree. But on this issue, I'm not really sure if push has come to shove and whether or not the powers that be will protect us in that way. I don't know, and this is a difficult subject even to even talk about, even within our own communities. How to resist it. To me, I see the seed saving movement and the seed sovereignty movement as the foundation of the food movement, and as a part of a growing dissatisfaction with the current system that you see before you. We hear about all these things going on the past few years through the plague and through this new war that's cropped up in Europe, that there's definite weaknesses in the current economic system that will affect all of us. So if you see yourselves within that general resistance movement, and for you Canadians, I think that would be beneficial to start forming unions, talking to workers unions and that, and I don't know, grow food. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll come back to this one maybe. This one's hard.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. I'm going to return to the chat and see if there's some, well, we're going to be flowing in and out, I think, of cultural and technical conversations here. I think that's okay. So one of those is about the PBR database. Oh, okay, Kaitlyn got that one in the chat. Are there bag tags in Canada? Asks Jocelyn from Ceremony Farm.
Yep, there are. Oftentimes a seed contract or the terms of a PBR or a patent will be included in a bag tag. Yeah, or it sometimes you'll have it in a smaller degree on a seed pack.
Question about Aussie, and this was maybe covered a little bit in your presentation, Christy and Kaitlyn. Is Aussie a tool that can protect from overreaching capital interests? Is it a little bit more nuanced than that? You sort of talked a little bit about the informality of it, and so I think there might be some clarification there needed in terms of how far those public domain initiatives can go to sort of affect the IPR frameworks.
I guess there's two ways you could approach this question as a form of resistance. There's a way in which capitalist agriculture, as it's come to be in what's recently been known to be called Canada, is protected by the state. In a way, there's a lot of institutions that have been created by the settler state to protect independent commodity producing farmers. So like your regular kind of stereotypical idea of what a farmer is, like supply management, these seeds regulations and everything. There are those state granted protections that exist. There is none of those state granted protections that exist in this way. Aussie is effectively toothless in that way. However, the state is not the only source of power. There is also grassroots power and collective capacity and autonomous actions done by people organizing outside of the state. And Aussie pledges, as such as they are now, don't have the capacity to that degree. It does not mean, though, that we cannot develop the collective capacity as a group of autonomous people to protect our own seed interests operating together. We can operate outside the state too. So the answer, unfortunately, is yes and no.
Thanks, Christy. Luke?
I had a question in response to that, and maybe it's to go to the general crowd here as well. What are, in fact, the consequences of breaking these laws? What can they do to you?
That is a fantastic question, and probably something we could have included more about. It's criminal law. If you break a patent, you can, well, it's not criminal law. It's you will be sued. You will be sued for damages based on violation of intellectual property rights. If you violate a PBR or a patent. If you violate a seed contract, then that is a matter of private contracts to be settled in contract law. And there, I could look more into penalties specifically about what that looks like. Although it is notable, there are some international cases with like tomato varieties in Italy where a farmer was, or like a seed producer was basically sued millions of dollars for selling seed that had a European PVP on it, or plant breeders' rights in Europe on it. I don't know the full details of that, but people do get sued for outrageous amounts of money for saving seeds. And I would also caution, there's a discourse that has been arising. People within the seed industry world are talking increasingly about pirated seeds, which is a supreme irony because it comes about through biopiracy or illegal seed or things like that. So please be watchful of these kinds of discourses because the seed industry is increasingly using it to create a negative impression of people who save seed. That said, there is not so much truth to much of these things. As re-emphasized, the majority of varieties that are available to everyday gardeners are not protected by any kind of intellectual property rights or contracts. Some of them are protected by a commons statement like an Aussie pledge. And I do always recommend doing outreach and seeking consent, always model consent in everything you do. But you don't have to worry about the vast majority of seed varieties. And of course, let's do some deep thinking about where those varieties came
from. Question from Becca, and then I see your request, Pilson, to share the PowerPoint screen. So I'm going to read Becca's question, and then I will pop that screen back up for us. Question: a grower asked me about shaving easy leaf lettuce, which has a trademark on it, and then some of the varieties that are listed on the breeder site that says they have patents on them. What I learned today is that if these varieties are not listed on the PBR site that was shared, then farmers in Canada can grow them for sale. Is that correct? I guess that's a bit of a clarifying question. Get that slide up now.
Yeah, just to make it very, very clear, if there's protections on a plant variety in the United States, patent or a PVP, utility patent, plant patent, doesn't matter which. If there is no PBR or patent in Canada or recognized by the Canadian state, it doesn't apply to you. And you can save it and distribute it all you like, according to the law. And regarding varieties that are covered, like sometimes in the Johnny's catalog, you'll see a trademark or something like that. So it'll be a trademark variety. That's a form of copyright. That's not a plant intellectual property thing. So you're just, if that trademark is in your country, like if Canada recognizes that trademark, you the laws just say you can't use that name in selling it. One example is Kamut wheat in Canada. You can't sell by the laws Kamut wheat by that name. You can call it coarsen wheat, though. There's no restrictions in that regard. So that's generally how that works. But if there is a trademark in the United States and we don't recognize it in Canada, go wild. No restrictions.
Great. I'll also say we can distribute these slides for sure to everyone who registered afterwards. So there's a lot of, I think every one of the varieties in this table is linked. I don't know if you can actually click on them in this format, but we'll distribute the slide deck to you guys so that you have access to that info. And a lot of this stuff will also be in the guide, I believe. So take a quick screenshot.
I see a related question there. Christy, maybe you can just clarify. I think the answer is yes, but Shannon from Broad Fork asks if we can only distribute those seeds within Canada. I'm guessing that you mean, which I would think that would be yes.
That's another good question. If it's a protected variety in the United States, you cannot sell it to the United States. You would be violating the laws in the United States.
And a couple comments earlier, the person with the crossed forks or whatever, Farm Folk City, or are any examples of seedback movements for example, Indigenous groups suing a seed company for anything that, not to my knowledge. And then going back to that statement about suing somebody, this we have separate governance structures, and this gets us into sticky territory, legally speaking. In that we're utilizing a foreign government's law to achieve something that we might need, and therefore we have to continue on referring to that and using it and underpinning our discussion thereon, because that's the process we've chosen to use. Now, in Canada, there are several court cases, several dozen or so, that talk about land rights issues and resource issues and things like that. The big ones being Delgamuukw way back in the 90s, and then the ones that grew out of Delgamuukw, and finally with Chilcotin in 2013. Broadly speaking, the Supreme Court of Canada has said that we have a right to our land and things like that, but they've not gone on and defined all of those things. So it's a long game that is frustrating and, to me, not useful, in the sense that it doesn't immediately upend the sovereignty that Canada has put upon itself. And that's really the question that's at hand when you talk about suing somebody through their system, is that you're asking the Supreme Court to deny Canadian sovereignty, which they're not going to do. It's not going to happen. Never. They can dance around the issue a lot and define it away until it becomes nothing but a municipality powers. So in that sense, suing a company, at least for us, Haudenosaunee, would not be on the table. Perhaps other nations would choose to do that, but I would encourage them not to, because that'll set a precedent for the rest of us, unfortunately, in how Canada acts towards us. Yeah, so just addressing that one.
Well, I mean, speaking for myself, I'm very grateful to be made aware of Indigenous government jurisdiction in this context. And I think that's probably one of the most important things to come out of this webinar, is to, think about the seeds as an extension of the land, and the land is being governed by different and diverse bodies. And I think before we release the guide, we have some thinking to do about that, and some thinking to do in general about this work. So one of the questions that we opened our webinar with is, how do we as good treaty people support seed saving? And I think that your story relates back to that question in such a visceral way, and really gives it, for me, it gives it whole new meaning. So thank you. And Luke, thank you for offering, I think, the question that we're gonna close on. You know, what are these frameworks worth, and how do we actually expect them to protect anyone's seed? I don't really know what else there is to be said. Your contributions have been remarkable and generous. I'm just gonna thank all of you, Luke, Christy, and Kaitlyn, for being here and for sharing your wisdom and your knowledge in these two very different sort of realms. We're a little bit over time. I'm not gonna do a poll or go to any of my closing slides. I'm just gonna end by saying thank you. And we'll look forward to being in touch with you as a community in the aftermath of the webinar. And we hope to continue to stay connected. Thanks, everybody.